In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips for beginning poker players that will help you take your poker skills to the next level. And whether you are a tournament player or a cash game player playing micro stakes at home or medium stakes at a local casino, these tips are going to ensure that you develop good habits that will ensure long-term success. So let's get right to tip number 1. It is vitally important that you approach luck like professionals approach luck. It's important to understand that there is a lot of variance in poker. So many poker players think that they are going to show up to the casino and win every time, which does not happen. I hate to break it to you. No matter how good you are going to go on big upswings and big downswings. It is very, very important that you focus on making good decisions and not necessarily on making sure that you're up or that you win the hand. Because if you think about it, an easy way to win most of the hands that you play is to just go all in before the flop. Everyone's going to fold most of the time and you're going to win. Unless they call and then you're going to be in terrible shape and then you're going to lose a ton of money. So understand that your goal is to make the best decision possible at each decision point. And sometimes that's going to work out, but other times it is not. And that is okay. Also, I hear players who are new to the game, or sometimes long-term players, discuss things like waiting for a rush of cards where they'll win a hand or two and then they decide they're going to start playing every hand because they won 2 hands in a row, so they're more likely to win the next one. But cards do not have a memory. The cards do not care if you won 15 hands in a row. The next hand is going to be another completely random hand. Other players say things like 10s are running hot at this table, where a 10 will come on the flop for 3 hands in a row or something like that. And then they start playing any hand with a 10 because if they have a 10, they're going to make a pair, and a pair of 10s is pretty good. But again, that is not how poker works. So many players try to think, well, what do they even do? They just assume that there are things in the game that are under their control or that there are various streaks that they can somehow manipulate. But every time the dealer shuffles the cards are going to be random, and you have to accept that. And also realize that you are going to have big swings, even if you are a world-class poker player. And if you're a beginning poker player, well, you're probably not nearly as good as a world-class player, which means you are going to have incredibly big swings, sometimes in the downward direction, and realize that is okay. Let's get to tip number 2. You want to make sure that you get rid of your ego. Leave it at the door. So many players get it in their heads that either they want to be the table bully and run over everyone, or they may be sitting there playing and someone runs over them. They're playing a lot of pots, they're being talkative, they're being splashy, they're being aggressive, and many beginning players decide, I'm going to get that player and teach them a lesson. But listen to yourself. Listen to how silly this all sounds. You're going to teach this player a lesson. What if you just don't get any good cards against this player? What if you happen to get it all in with pocket aces and you lose to their 9-3 suited? You know, you can't really control these types of things. Remember, all you can do is make the best decision possible at all decision points. And it's important to realize that just because someone is aggressive, talkative, battly, whatever, that it's not your job to get them. Instead, you want to ask, what does this player do incorrectly that I can take advantage of? For example, if this player is raising way too many hands before the flop, well, you can call with a wider range and you can re-raise them with a wider range. Or if they are just insanely aggressive and they'll blast off their stack every single time by the river, call preflop with all sorts of hands, make top pair, and then don't fold and have them bluff off into you. And realize that even then, sometimes they are going to beat you. And that is okay. Make sure you do not get in these ego wars where all of a sudden you start playing back at them with garbage for legitimately no good reason. Please, 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 please. Check the ego at the door. Get it out of here. Just focus on making the best decision possible at all decision points. And also, make sure you stay humble. I have watched countless players be good, studious players, but then they all of a sudden go on a good run and they win a bunch of money. And then they think, I'm the best poker player in the world. I don't need to study anymore. I'm going to move up in stakes and crush my opponents. And that's inevitably when they go broke. They get very confident, very cocky, and that usually does not work out well for them. You have to make sure you're always studying and always realizing and understanding that the players who are winning in the games higher than your games are probably better than you. And whenever you move up to those stakes, don't think you're just automatically going to start crushing the games, because quite often you will not even know the strategies they are using against the various players in the game. So you want to make sure that you always stay humble and that you are always learning. Many of the best players in the world spend countless hours learning, and if they are, well, you should be doing the same thing. Tip number 3 is that position in poker is everything. And there are a few reasons for this. The main one is that it gives you an informational advantage. If you get to act last, you get to see what your opponent does first, and quite often that will make your life easy. Imagine you're playing rock, paper, scissors, and your opponent always has to go first. Well, they're probably not going to win, right? They throw a rock, you throw a paper. Easy game. And poker's not exactly like that, but to some extent, it is. Because let's say you're on the river and you are out of position. You have to act first. And you know you want to put in a little bit of money, but not a lot of money. Let's say you have top pair with a marginal kicker, and you'd love to be able to get another bet in the pot. So you bet. But what if your opponent raises? Well, now that's terrible, right? Because you wanted to play a medium pot and not a gigantic pot. So let's say instead you check. But then your opponent just decides to check behind. Well, now you don't get your money in the pot, right? But let's say instead you're in position with that pair. Well, you know you're not going to check it behind because you'd like to get money in the pot, and you can now put in the bet. And unless your opponent was getting tricky and putting in a check raise, they're usually going to call or fold, and that's going to be very good for you. So you're going to find that when you're in position, you have an informational advantage, and that allows you to put one more bet into the pot when you feel inclined, which is very, very important in No Limit Texas Hold'em, because pots grow exponentially, because you typically bet somewhere in relation to the size of the pot, and by the river, when you get to put that last bet in, that last bet is usually going to be quite substantial. So being in position lets you control the size of the pot, which is very valuable. It's also important to realize that chips flow to the left, because the people who have position on you are going to win more than their fair share of pots against you. And the people on your right are going to lose more than their fair share of pots against you. Going back to leaving your ego at the door, a lot of people get annoyed at the players on their left because they're winning a lot of pots against them. But you have to realize that is what is supposed to happen. So you have to make sure you're winning an adequate amount of pots from the players on your right. So since you want to have position, how can you ensure you have position more than your opponents? Well, you play a tight strategy from the early positions and a looser strategy from the late positions. If you look at game theory optimal charts, you will see that the button gets to play a much wider range in all scenarios than the under the gun player, the player who's first act before the flop. Something a lot of beginners do wrong is they play a lot of hands from the small blind. They think that if someone raises, they should call a lot because they have to put in, well, half a big blind less than if they were not in the small blind. But the small blind is actually a spot where you should be re-raising, 3-betting, a lot before the flop, because what's going to happen is if you call in the small blind, now the big blind's going to call a decent amount of the time because they're closing the action. And on the flop, you're going to check, the big blind's going to check, the initial raiser will either bet or check depending on what they want to do, but then the small blind has to act before the big blind. And if the big blind happen to be checking with a good hand, you're going to be in a very, very bad spot. And you're out of position in general, which is also very bad. So you're going to find that from the small blind when someone raises, quite often you want to be re-raising or folding most of the hands that you are going to play. Also, when you're playing deep stacked poker, position becomes even more important. Because if you're playing shallow stacked poker, if you're all in before the flop, let's say, position is then irrelevant because your opponent cannot punish you after the flop by being generally aggressive and making you fold out middle pair and type hands, right? Whereas if you're all in before the flop, you always get to see the showdown. So you're going to find that position becomes even more relevant as you get deeper and deeper stacked. So make sure that you focus on playing most of your hands in position because that is going to be where you're going to win a lot of the money that you win from poker. Let's get to tip number 4. In order to win at poker, you simply must be very aggressive. Because whenever you're aggressive, you get to steal pots or steal equity from your opponents that does not belong to you. as a very clear example, say someone raises from middle position, and then you are in the small blind with 9-8 suited, okay? That's a spot where a lot of players call, they see the flop, and then they check fold the flop whenever they don't make a hand. But imagine instead, you re-raise before the flop, and your opponent folds. Well, now, you just took whatever they raised before the flop and added it to your stack, which is highly valuable. Or imagine they call, and then you continuation bet on the flop, and if they don't have a hand, they're going to fold. Well, now you're winning whatever they called before the flop by you making the continuation bet. So you're essentially forcing your opponent to fold out better hands, or hands that have some chance to win. Whereas if you check, you do not have that opportunity. So you're going to find that it is important to be aggressive. And especially in the small and medium stakes games, it is vitally important that you continuation bet after the flop frequently. I know a lot of players think that their opponents are extreme calling stations in the small stakes games, but assuming you're playing for real money and not play money, most players do not want to put all their money in the pot by the river unless they have a good hand. So going back to that situation where someone raises and you re-raise from the small blind with 9-8 suited, if the flop comes and you bet medium, they call. On the turn, you bet, let's say, medium again, and they call. If you think on the river they do not have a good, strong top pair or a better hand, you should be making a big bet a lot of the time, because most players fold out something like top pair bad kicker or worse to a substantial river bet. What a lot of people do wrong, though, is they re-raise the 9-8 suit before the flop, bet tiny on the flop, bet tiny on the turn, and then check the river. And they never give their opponents a chance to actually fold. So it's important to make sure that you play aggressively, not just before the flop and on the turn, but also aggressively on the river. That way you win a lot of pots that do not actually belong to you. Let's get to the final tip. Make sure to enjoy yourself. Realize that poker is a game, and we play games to add value and joy to our lives. Do not let the routine swings of the game affect your mental state. So many beginning poker players make the blunder of just playing way too big of stakes to the point that if they lose, it is detrimental for their finances, but also for their emotions. And you do not want to let poker negatively impact your life. But I realize a lot of people do exactly that, and they are screwing up. So if you're a beginning poker player, you want to make sure you're not playing for money that is way too big for you. Just because a game exists does not mean that you have to play it. Let's say you have $1,000 to your name, and one of your friends says, hey, let's go play this poker game where we buy in for $200. Probably not a good idea, because losing 20% of your money will cause emotional trauma. So say, no thanks, the game's too big for me. Don't be sad or offended or feeling like you're missing out. Realize that it is okay to not play, especially in games that are too big. And when you are just starting to learn to play poker, make sure that you play tiny, because very often if you're new to the game, or even if you're not necessarily new to the game, if you're not winning a substantial amount of money from the game, you're probably not more skilled than your opponents. In order to win at poker, you have to make sure that you're playing in games that you can beat, and that may mean playing really, really, really tiny stakes games. And the nice thing about tiny stakes games is it is a great way to get a lot of experience. So make sure that you have fun and you enjoy your experience. You only have one life to live, and if losing at poker makes you miserable, you're probably not doing it right. So that's it. Those are my 5 tips for beginning poker players. I hope you make a point to implement them. If any of these tips resonate with you, let me know in the comment section below. I read every single comment that comes through on my YouTube channel, and I am happy to get in there and interact with you and answer whatever questions you have and help in whatever way that I can. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.